take those sediment particles, they're going to move down the rivers, come to the ocean, and there's one really kind of cool environment that we have local to us, which is a lot of fjords. And so Caroline is going to talk about a fjord off of British Columbia, off of Vancouver Island, and some of the analysis she's done on the sediment within that fjord.
So specifically, I'm going to talk about sources of metals and of the surface sediment that carries those metals in this fjord, Tahsin Inlet, like she said, on the western side of Vancouver Island. So here's why you should care. Does anyone like shellfish? Well, the shellfish that you eat likes to burrow in sediment, and if there's a ton of arsenic in that sediment, the shellfish you're eating is going to kill you. And how many people aren't like super cool with that? And that's not the only problem. So like, even though metals usually get trapped in sediment and stay there for a really long time, and that's kind of an issue, if there's a lot of turbulence in the area, like we see in fjords, it can be resuspended in the water column. And particularly copper is super terrible for salmon. And I know everyone in the Pacific Northwest like hates eating salmon, but copper is like really bad for their olfactory senses. It makes it really hard for them to find where they're supposed to go, their mates and such. So this is why you should care about my research. Here are my specific questions. I'm going to try and figure out what are the sources of the various metals that I'm studying, and then I'm going to try and put that in environmental context. So this is kind of a lot of stuff on the map, but the things I would kind of like you to focus on are that up here are the smaller member stations to the north, near these two rivers, and then they increase as they go south. And down here is Nuka Sound, which is directly connected to the ocean, so this is basically seawater down here. And then try to remember that there's Tahsin Narrows that comes in around T05 and T06, and it starts up here in Symposium Inlet. And then over here, the start of my project, I was super interested in a sill. A sill is just when glaciers come in, they pile a bunch of sediment and it makes this big mountain, and then they retreat and not behind. So here, there's a lot of interesting physical transport, which I think Andrea would prefer if I stuff too. But I went into some chemistry. And so these are about 0.25 kilometers apart, and these ones are about 1.5 kilometers apart. And then remember these river stations, Soen and Lanier, those are basically freshwater samples.
Yep.
All right, so back in December, for about 10 days, the senior class of oceanography went up to Vancouver Island in this boat, the Thomas G. Thompson. And for about a day and a half, I did shipwreck and van beam grabs. This is a shipwreck grab. It's a spring-loaded mechanism. You drop it down, the weight releases the spring, and it just closes a bunch of sediment. And then we also use a van beam grab, which I don't have a picture of, but it's basically a closed claw that drops down, and as it comes up, it pulls sediment up with it. Some of the really fine samples didn't do well with the van beam grab. It kind of just hammered through that fine sediment, and we lost all the surface, which is what I'm interested in. So for those ones, we used the shipwreck, which just traps it inside. And then the van beam was a lot better for some of these coarser still stations that were pulling up gravel and rocks. So once I had these samples, came back to them and did a few analyses. Grain size analysis, I used the sieve and pipette method. So for grain size, what you should remember throughout this presentation is that we have gravel, which is like rock size, and then we have sand, which if you feel sand between your fingers, it's like gritty. You can feel like sandpaper. And then we have silt and clay, which sometimes I'll collectively call mud, which you feel between your fingers and you can't really feel anything. It's like feeling silk. And the sieve and pipette method is, the pipette method's a little old school, but it's kind of cool. You basically drop some of your subsample into these settling columns, and you use the fact that bigger particles settle faster than smaller particles. So if you use the settling equation, you know at what depth, at what time, that size particle is going to be there, and you drop a long pipette in there, and you draw it up a certain amount, and you know how much is in there. And I didn't actually do this analysis. Someone over in Forestry Sciences did it for me, which is important to remember that this person usually works with soil, not sediment from the ocean. And he did what he called inductively coupled plasma. I don't know how to explain that because I don't actually know what it is, but and you guys have heard about loss of ignition. I was really thinking I was going to have to explain that, so thanks everyone for getting that for me. All right, so here's the first statistical analysis that I did of my data. The problem is I had like 25 different types of data, and it's really hard to analyze that, making tons of linear analyses, or it could be exponential or whatever. This is principal components analysis, which does that for me. It does it across a lot of dimensions, and it finds covariance. So basically what you need to understand from this is that when things cluster together, it means they're linearly varied with each other. So I see two basic ones and then a bunch of outliers. Remember that type 1 is yellow with these, with D50. D50 is the median grain size. And these other metals. And then type 2 is this set of metals. You don't have to remember them specifically, but keep it in mind. So from that, I pulled out a proxy metal for each one. If they're all linearly varied, you can choose one that represents all of them. And for type 1, I chose potassium. For type 2, I chose molybdenum. What I'd like you to notice specifically on this graph is that these river stations in diamonds, they kind of stay the same for the D50, but in the organic carbon and the potassium, they kind of plummet down to some of the lowest values. And then notice that these three variables that were all together in type 1 vary a lot more and are super different from this guy, who starts kind of high and goes kind of low. These guys kind of vary up and down. And then remember, this is about the TO5, TO6 place where that bios water comes in. So I didn't do this analysis. I got this from someone else. But it sort of is showing that Ceballos water has a huge, important seawater input. Because when you have lower delta C13 values, usually it means higher rain input, and higher C13 values usually means larger terrestrial input, which makes sense. You got these rivers up here, high delta C13. So basically what I'm saying is these variables and this graph sort of is proving to us that Ceballos water is super important in Tahsin. So why would that be important? Well, maybe if there was a ton of mines at the top of Ceballos, putting a bunch of copper into Tahsin, it would be kind of a problem because Tahsin is pretty well populated up here. So you can see Tahsin, no mines. Ceballos, a bunch of mines. I don't know if you guys are getting that from this graphic. That's what I see anyway. And the reason why we see copper a little bit further north than maybe the TO5, TO6, this bottom water sort of all transports north, net transports north. Sometimes it goes south, but in general, it's carrying the bottom sediment north. And these mines were basically all in the 1950s. They've been closed. But water takes a long time to transport from here to here. So basically now we're starting to see this huge input of all these mining products in Tahsin. And they're traveling further and further up to where we've got this big town of Tahsin right here. I wouldn't say big, it's actually tiny, but whatever. So the main issue for this is that we're scared of arsenic. We're all scared of it. I am. I dream about it every night. But the problem is my data, I think we have a lot of false negatives because grain size is super correlated, you saw with some of these metals. And I sent in just sort of random subsamples, and I think they weren't fine enough for some of them. I think some of them were too sandy to get back accurate measurements, and so they say 0, but they're not really 0. And I went back and looked at these mineral potential profiles, and there is arsenic in the bedrock. And so if you're going and mining for gold and copper, you're not looking for arsenic, but you're releasing it into the groundwater anyway. This right here is the recommended line by the EPA of what arsenic should be in surface sediment. This is where it is at TO7. That's not like super awesome, it's not like my favorite thing in the world to see arsenic super high. But yeah, so that's why you guys should be terrified. I'd like to acknowledge a bunch of people. Some of them are here. Some of them aren't, but thank you anyway. Any questions?
Any questions from the audience?
I have a question.
Yes.
I was wondering why you chose molybdenum to analyze.
Oh, okay, so I didn't include it here, but I did another type of analysis called non-metric multidimensional scaling on the stations across metals. And what that gave me was which metals had the highest explanation of variance across stations. And I chose molybdenum because it had the highest variance explained across stations. Yeah, that's a good question. I was hoping it didn't come up, actually. Sort of a little hand wavy.
Copper mining? So you said it sort of peaked in the 50s?
It's coming back. It's kind of scary. So I was looking at, there's another graphic. They have prospective mining. They have developed prospect. They're trying to bring a few of these gold and copper mines back because back in the day they didn't have the good mining. They think there's to get all of it out, but they think there's still a lot more. And they're like, we know how to do this even better, so we should really just dig in there for that gold and copper. So yeah, it's kind of terrifying after seeing this.
Yeah. So could your results be used in sort of environmental impact statements?
Definitely. This is the first time anyone's ever done a study in this area on this. I had another graphic that's actually really kind of scary. This website has like all of the data that the government of BC has in that area, and you can just lay it on there, like as a data layer. And it has one, environmental impact assessment reports, and there are none in this area. They're all on the east side of Vancouver Island, and I'm like, all this mining, and then you look over at the other data layer and it's zero impact reports. So yeah, definitely this needs to, I have another, people need to go back and do it again, do it in BIOS, do it in Tahsin narrows to make sure that, see what's happening in that area, I think.
Well, if they do where you're talking about, if they were to do another study, and they were to find out that it's gonna be really bad down the road from fish or whatever, wildlife, then the people with all the money wouldn't be able to go up there to do what they want to do to get more money.
Yeah. So it's probably never going to get funded. I'll sneak on up there, swim down, and get some samples of myself.
Yeah. Sleep with something under your pillow.
Is there any plan for transferring this information to the agencies in Canada? I mean, it would be obvious if it was a US site.
Yeah. So I'm sort of, I've been communicating a lot with the BC government. They're not super willing to give information, but I think if I wanted to give them information, they would be happy to take it. I'm trying to actually publish this research, and that would, I don't know where I would publish that. There's a BC paper that publishes this kind of thing that I'm looking into, but also like maybe just doing something for the BC government, just sending them the data set itself and maybe an impact report or something like that. I've been looking into it, but it's a lot of work. And they weren't helpful when I needed them. So.
All right, thank you, Carol. Elizabeth is our next speaker, but we have a few minutes, so just, we don't want to get too far ahead so that people can know our time.